Hello, everyone. I'm Claire Appleby. I'm the Architecture Advisor at Theatres Trust, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Sustainable Theatres, a Wider View, which will explore the different challenges and opportunities theatres experience in their goal to be more sustainable. This webinar is part of a series for Resilient Theatres, Resilient Communities, which is a 3-year pilot support programme that has been generously supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, as well as funding from the Pilgrim Trust and the Swire Charitable Trust. This is now our second year of the programme, and this is the second webinar for 2024. Previous webinars have included the themes of audience development, governance, fundraising, and planning for heritage buildings. The next webinar will be in mid-November, and we'll share more details by the end of the summer via our website, newsletter, and social media. Please do keep an eye out for those details, and I really hope you can all join us again for that next webinar. So before we start, a few quick housekeeping notes. As mentioned, this is part of a pilot project, so we would be grateful for all your feedback. Shortly after the event, you will receive an email with a link to a short online survey. We would really appreciate it if you could complete that and return it to us to give us your views on the webinar. Your views are important and it helps us shape our next and future webinars. Please can I ask you all to turn off your videos and microphones during the event, and we do request that attendees keep these settings for the duration of the event so that everybody can hear our speakers clearly and without interruption. We recommend that you choose the side-by-side speaker view in order to see both the slides and the speakers. We are recording this event and we will be sharing a link to the edited video by the end of next week. We'll also share the slides from today's webinar. We have enabled captioning on the webinar, and if you'd like to make use of this, then please select Live Transcript, which is the small CC button on your Zoom toolbar. If you have any technical issues, please do use the chat box to send your message to Theatres Trust host directly, not to everyone, and a member of our team will do their best to assist you. We will have around 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for audience questions, and we invite you to type your comments and questions into the chat. Where relevant, please do indicate which speaker your query is directed to. And we will aim to respond to as many of those questions as possible. If we run out of time and don't get to your question, we'll be in touch via email after the webinar to respond to you directly. So before I hand over to today's speakers, a very quick introduction. Today's webinar will be an overview of the key successes and challenges involved in theatres embarking on their journey towards sustainability. We'll highlight the different resources that theatres use to tackle the challenges faced, focusing on buildings and heritage, looking at resources that are readily available, including the Theatre Green Book, as well as taking a wider look at the importance of leadership and of people. This is very much an introductory overview of sustainability for those working within theatre. It's aimed at an introductory level to those relatively new to the issues or just starting or at the early stages in their journey. So it's really great to see attendees from across a broad range of theatre background. We have a fantastic panel of speakers for you today. You'll hear first from Andrew Wiley, partner at engineering consultancy bureau Happold. Andrew will discuss the broader context within which theatre sustainability initiatives sit in relation to buildings and share insights from across other arts sectors, including discussing some of the common challenges faced by arts buildings and theatres across the UK. Andrew's talk will be followed by a presentation from Colin Johnston, Deputy CEO at Blackpool Grand, who will share his perspective on the importance of leadership when working towards sustainability, whether for influence in other sectors or getting buy-in from trustees, all very important issues. And finally, we'll hear from Angela Watchner, General Manager at the Bush Theatre in London, who will talk about the Bush's sustainability journey with a particular focus on the impact of and on its people, from its employees to suppliers and local communities. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our first speaker, who is Andrew Wiley. As I've mentioned, Andrew is partner at leading engineering consultancy bureau Happold. He's also Bureau Happel's lead on their work with the Theatre Green Book, which, for those who haven't come across it already, is a free resource to support theatres and theatre practitioners to make every aspect of their work more environmentally sustainable. So it covers productions, operations and buildings. It's an initiative that's been adopted by theatres across the globe and has been translated into, I think, and Andrew, you can correct me, 6, but possibly more now languages. And
Definitely more.
More, yeah, it increases the whole time. And in addition to Bureau Happel's work with Theatre Green Book, Andrew's also been heavily involved in the publication of the Arts Green Book, and he'll be drawing on all of this work in his presentation today, providing that important broader context to sustainability and its role in building resilience in the theatre sector. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Claire, and great to be here talking with you all. And just to add, I'm a structural engineer by training and background, and have been very fortunate to design many buildings, but more recently became a trustee of the Lowry, and do appreciate the challenges of delivering and working within a theatre organisation. So next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit around the Theatre Green Book. Its latest version, but then also going to draw, as Claire suggested or mentioned, about talk to you a little bit about wider research and work which we've done within the arts sector, because I think there's some very key learning and key points to draw to your attention. Next slide, please. Before I do that, just wanted to flag a very recent survey that's just been published by on research of over 17,000 theatre goers by Indigo. Some really insightful feedback from patrons. Looking at the views that they have around the attention to and the delivery of decarbonisation and sustainability within theatres, but also the potential for financial benefit in that they are more likely to donate and more likely to pay more for tickets with organisations that are really driving in this space. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the Theatre Green Book has recently been relaunched in one volume now. The 3 volumes of sustainable productions, operations and buildings are now condensed into one volume. One key part of this is to be able to start to bring a level of continuity and parity between the efforts around work that's been put on stage, the operation of the building, and actually the making the building asset as sustainable as possible. And with that, the opportunity for self-certification to be able to communicate to your patrons and to your audiences around the levels of attainment and the progress that you are making within on your sustainability journey. Next slide. So what I'm going to be talking about and focused this afternoon is very much around the buildings aspect of this, and there is no change of significance within Volume 2 around the core principles of the recommendations and the process, and this is based around a set of priority interventions around the building envelope, insulation of your building, and importantly, as you'll see in the case studies that I'm just going to share with you later, making your building as airtight as possible. It is then also focused around efficiency next in that hierarchy priority. So that is around making sure that there is good controls and using less energy within your buildings, effectively turning things off when you're not using them, or adjusting and being able to adjust the level of intensity of energy use dependent on the occupancy of your building. Then in the final step in this priority hierarchy is looking at renewable energy and on-site generation. So that in most cases is looking at installation of photovoltaics. We do have to remember that it is a we're not just in a climate emergency. There is an emergency around biodiversity, ecology, and water use, and so the Green Book continues to make recommendations in this space. Next slide, please. One key change is a moving away from an online tool for the assessment of your buildings to a very simple downloadable spreadsheet that contains the same sets of questions and helps you get to know your building. And by you knowing your building, you're actively engaged in understanding the risks that you contain within the building, just around your own operational resilience, but also where those areas are for improvement. This home survey tool categorizes your interventions around easy wins, maintenance projects, and capital investment projects. And really importantly, in the notes on the right hand side, there are details around next steps and where to go to seek professional guidance in support of implementing particular interventions and changes to your building. Next slide, please. As Claire mentioned, alongside the Theatre Green Book, the Arts Green Book, Volume 2, the Sustainable Buildings, was commissioned by the Arts Council and the GLA. This looked at more widely at particularly at heritage buildings, as well as a whole range of different arts typologies. Next slide, please. Supported by the or for the NMDC, Buro Happold were commissioned to undertake a set of case studies looking at the impact and the magnitude of carbon reductions and cost savings that could result from implementation of recommendations from that home survey and from the Arts Green Book. We specifically wanted to look at historic buildings where that challenge around heritage, maintenance, and the context of listed status. We looked at these 6 buildings, so Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, Bowes Museum at Barnard Castle, Yorkshire Museum, Leeds City Museum, Museum of the Home, and the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. Alongside just our physical investigation and work through that home survey in sending engineers to these buildings, we wanted to contextualize this in the museums across the UK. That's why we started to we gathered the free to access. Next slide, please. Free to access, download, DEC, display energy certificate information. This is a set of information that if you are a public building with a floor area over 250 square meters, you're required to display. Next slide, please. It's very much like you'll be familiar with that, the iconography of the attainment levels around is something which you see on white goods, but they're useful to us as far as there is a significant publicly accessible set of data around this. There is the measurement and the attainment level is consistently assessed. It has been consistently assessed since 2008, and it allows us to start to compare similar scale type of buildings and then start looking for areas of commonality and areas where similar interventions can be, and the magnitude of impact on energy savings that those interventions can have. That has helped us form a fuller picture for the museum sector across the UK, and is starting to help us make proposals and advise NMDC on their cases to case to government for investment. And we've been doing a similar thing for the Theatres Trust historically. Next slide, please. So large amounts of data comes in spreadsheet format, but what we are able to do is start to look at interactive and put this into an interactive format, so we can start to compare by region, by building typology, and start to be able to see where buildings perform against peer organisations. Next slide, please. So in doing that, in creating these case studies for the NMDC, it was very clear to us the magnitude of the impact of those 251 museum organisations that had display energy certificates, and a significant amount of energy consumption, and therefore significant potential for overall energy reduction that sat with them. Next slide, please. So the case studies which we've done, and I would also highlight that within on the Theatre Green Book website, there are a suite of very similar case studies which we carried out, very similar methodology of visiting buildings and using the home survey tool to look at reductions. The reason I'm sharing you these is the final 3 slides we're just about to come on to, which looks at themes and areas of for improvement and the likely magnitude of those carbon reductions within those buildings. Very similar themes to ones which, particularly for heritage and historic theatre buildings, are applicable. So these case studies, we look at the DEC and look at comparable organisations. We look at their energy consumption, but then it's very much a physical look around the infrastructure of the building. Next slide, please. So then recommendations when you're using the home survey tool are put filter out under quick wins, things which you can do outside of a firm shutdown for maintenance, but things which are implementable with relatively low capital expenditure and relatively low disruption to day-to-day operations. Maintenance projects which, when you are going through annual cycles of maintenance, I hope you are, but to encourage you to do that. And then capital projects where significant elements of investment are needed for improvements, or might actually also be something where if you are planning a capital project for an extension or modification of your building, the things that could be incorporated into that to benefit your energy reduction and decarbonisation. Next slide, please. So the outputs and the common themes, measured outputs from these 6 buildings, and then the percentage here are on carbon reduction. So quick wins, the key common themes around timing schedules and being able to turn off plant when they're not operating. Draft proofing. This is actually something which comes up in multiple in multiple sections, but there will be draft proofing that does require more intrusive work, but some draft proofing might just be making sure that equipment and covers on duct outlet inlets and things are operating and functioning correctly. And actually for museums, but it could similarly apply to auditoria, but actually looking and seeing whether your set points for the temperatures and humidities which you're operating your plant at are appropriately set, and you're not overcooling or overheating spaces. Next slide, please. So maintenance projects. Some of this may be familiar to you, but things around common theme, which I'm sure is probably on the tops of people's tick lists, around switching to LED lighting, but actually installing sensors and controls to lighting, installing heating controls, submetering, particularly on larger buildings where you've got multiple zones of heating, improving air tightness within buildings, particularly around finding this out through doing thermal imaging surveys, and then being able to close up leaking envelope and elements within buildings, and improving and repairing insulation. Insulation may well be installed, but is it damaged? Is it continuous and complete? Next slide, final slide. Adding additional insulation to bring buildings up to building envelope and insulation up to code or enhanced code. Repairing windows and adding secondary glazing was a very common theme and potential, particularly with historic building envelopes and windows. One of the biggest potentials for savings as far as decarbonisation is concerned, and is a significant capital investment, but moving to air source heat pumps, removing gas-fired boilers from buildings, something which is by putting in your plan is something which you can work towards a capital project in the future around. So planning to, in the future, knowing when gas-fired boilers, gas boilers are going to be needing to be replaced, and starting to work towards and planning for that. And interestingly, photovoltaics scored relatively low in these case studies we looked at, partly because of available roof space, partly because some of these buildings, wherever available roof space, were already had installed photovoltaics. This almost concludes what I was wanting to share with you, but I think that the real real thing I'd encourage, and certainly I regularly hear and have these challenges at the Lowry, is, well, we have no money to do this. Well, it's great having a plan, but I would very much encourage having a plan. Getting to understand your building in greater levels of detail. It will help you to understand where there are potential weak points and areas, potential failure points just around that theme of resilience. But then by developing a plan, you can start to work through your maintenance schedules. You can start to think about how you might look to different funding streams, but I'd also say communicate your plan, share with other partner theatres and organisations. There may well be things that you are wanting to implement that other partners or other local businesses want to implement, and collective buying power as well can be of benefit in those instances as well. So communicate, make a plan, communicate the plan, and put timeframes around implementation of that plan. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Andrew. Some really good advice there, particularly in kind of preparing those plans. I'm sure many people in the audience will be reassured to know they're not alone in the challenges faced, and that also there's a huge amount of knowledge out there that can be learned through sharing really widely, not just across theatres, but across the arts sectors. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions from the audience later on. So now on to our second presentation, which is from Colin Johnston, Deputy CEO at Blackpool Grand, which is a spectacular Grade 2-star listed Victorian theatre designed by Frank Matcham. Colin has been leading on the Grand's journey to sustainability, including leading on the theatre's master plan, a £10 million project to preserve the Grand for future generations and modernise its services to make it more environmentally and financially sustainable. Today, Colin will be speaking to us about the importance of leadership in sustainability and how he has approached this at Blackpool Grand. When signing up to the webinar, you will have seen a provocation asking for your experience of trying to keep sustainability a central consideration in the maintenance, development, or running of your theatre. So thank you so much to all who responded. Colin will be sharing some of these responses and commenting on the common challenges faced a little later in his presentation. So over to you, Colin.
Thank you, Claire. It's slightly tongue-in-cheek how I've entitled this presentation, How to Lead Without Really Trying. That's more about my management style, which is to gather really compelling evidence so decisions sort of make themselves rather than me having to browbeat anybody. So next slide, please. So I began this journey around 12 years ago. Blackpool Grand Theatre achieved Arts Council England NPO status And I discovered that we had a commitment through signing up for that to collect and report on our environmental achievements. This was really tricky because A, we didn't gather any data, didn't know what data to gather, and had no real idea how to evaluate it and report on it. That's me in quite the lonely space at that time, because I didn't know how to draw on the expertise of people like Andrew. So I reached out to the Arts Council. They launched a program with Julie's Bicycle that you've probably heard of at that time. And Julie's Bicycle over the last decade or so have been really supportive on that journey for me, understanding climate change and gathering the evidence to be able to speak relatively in an informed way about that. I did some research at the time, and I discovered that the UK was responsible for less than 1% of global carbon emissions, and that is falling at the moment. So I've got to say I was fairly sceptical about the impact that one 130-year-old Frank Matcham designed Grade 2 star listed theatre in a seaside town on the northwest coast of England could have on changing the direction of global warming and climate change. However, there was one thing that changed me from this skeptic-centric point of view to being a convert to trying to lead and do something about this. And that was the history of the carbonisation of the UK industry from the early days of the Industrial Revolution, where we were, for many years, the world's greatest polluter. We led that pack from 1750 until the early 20th century, when we were overtaken by the USA, then China, Russia and Germany, and more recently also by India, Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, Canada, and Mexico. But the fact that really struck me was cumulatively since 1750, we have the second highest CO2 emission record in history. And that sort of gave me the spur to try to do something about it. From my view, the UK created the problem through colonialism and industrialization, and we need to provide leadership in trying to come up with a solution. Next slide, please. I ran a workshop as part of a workshop a few weeks ago. This was one of the questions that came up in that workshop. So how do I get the information I need to make decisions about which technology to introduce, how to decarbonize building from someone who isn't trying to sell me something? It's very difficult. And how to convince others of the importance of reducing our carbon output. I needed to get some hard evidence. I was very lucky that my local Chamber of Commerce had announced the launch of a programme, a low carbon chamber, providing free energy efficiency survey. I signed up for that. And that sort of began me on the right path of the journey, because I got a prioritised list of potential carbon reduction measures in the building I could undertake. Each one was costed out and had most importantly, a payback timescale suggested. So that allowed me to prioritise our investment, our limited investment in what was required. Some of them, for instance, required behaviour change, which is relatively cost-free to do, probably more challenging, and Angela might talk about that in a moment. Some I could build into, as Andrew mentioned, rolling upgrades to bars and rooms around the building, and some required more serious investment. So I ended up with a prioritised list. Some of the areas where I got support was my local authority has introduced a scheme recently as part of Levelling Up, so it's fully funded. So I've got another similar review to the one I carried out about 12 years ago of our energy usage, and that was backed up by some investigation by external specialists. And a few years ago, Lancaster University provided a PhD student to research some of our stakeholders on the importance to them from a reputation point of view of our work in sustainability. Unfortunately, before we got to the report, COVID interrupted that. The person who was carrying out the report since graduated, but we're still talking to Lancaster University about getting some of that work undertaken again. So it really helped me, even with the evidence gathering and the research work, to understand our stakeholders' priorities, and that helped me to focus on what was important to them. Next slide, please. So this is a Danish smorgasbord, a menu. And much of our investment in carbon reduction has been grant funded, but it's becoming an increasingly competitive area. So if I can give you one piece of advice today, it's try to have a menu of projects that are researched, evidenced, costed, and ready to go at a series of different price points, say starting at 10,000 and up to maybe 250,000. When the opportunity, the grant window opportunity opens, and they tend to have a very short timescale, you'll be ready to submit a bid at whatever level of maximum funding is available. Now, the items on your menu may be part of a much bigger project. Claire mentioned our next capital project, a £10 million project. So the items on your menu may be part of that you've broken down into its constituent phases. Andrew mentioned the importance of having a plan, and we commissioned an architect that Andrew's well aware of, Paddy Dillon, who helped produce the Green Book, and Paddy produced a master plan for us that's guided our development and investment. I don't have the £10 million to complete it at the moment, but I have been successful in getting grants to complete some early packages of work, especially around sustainability. So if you set your overall vision and goal for the next 5 or 10 years in terms of how you want to develop the building, then it guides your thinking in terms of every successful grant application you make and moves you closer to that goal. An example of something that was on my sustainability menu was the voltage optimizer. I sort of tripped across that. I had no idea what it was, but some electrical contractors were doing work in the building, and they said you would be a prime candidate for a voltage optimizer. They had measured our voltage at around 19 points around the building, and our average voltage was 240 volts, when modern equipment is designed to operate at 220 volts. So in effect, we were burning electricity we didn't need to burn. There was a well-evidenced saving of around about 12% by installing the voltage optimizer. The other aspect of that is we were also burning equipment, because modern equipment is designed to operate at 220 volts. So by supplying a higher voltage, we were burning that equipment out earlier. It's more difficult to work out what the savings are on the equipment point of view and the extended life of that. So I did concentrate on the electricity saving. The payback period was going to be around about 4 to 5 years. So it was added to the menu, but pretty much near the bottom, because we didn't have that sort of money for that sort of payback period. And then Russia invaded Ukraine and electricity prices soared. So I reviewed the evidence, and it showed that with our current cost of electricity, the voltage optimizer payback period was now 8 months. So we'd no idea whether electricity prices were going to rise further, whether they're going to stabilize where they were, or whether they were going to come down. So I convinced my board to invest the £9,000 to install it, and it paid for itself in the first year. So that is something that you've got to consider, reviewing the menu quite often, because the cost of things like PVs and so on are coming down all the time. So they may well rise up your priority list. Next slide, please. So convincing the decision makers. How do I influence the people on my board, my management team, my CEO, and so on, to help them make the rational choice? So there are 3 pillars of sustainability. It usually starts with me asking myself 3 questions. Is it fit for purpose? So the technology I'm trying to introduce to reduce our carbon output, is there hard evidence that it delivers carbon reduction promised? Secondly, does it make financial sense? Will it save us money? Or has it got an extremely long period of payback? Or can we realistically find the money to fund it now so it doesn't bankrupt us? And finally, is it future-proof, or will it require a lot of maintenance and upgrades? And is there a process in place for recycling it at the end of life? In terms of my trustees, if I have answered those 3 questions to my satisfaction, it's usually quite easy to make the case for them. And being trustees and directors of the business, they tend to concentrate on financial viability and payback time. A couple of other things I do to convince them is produce an annual sustainability report. That was part of our requirement as an NPO. And that lists our achievements against goals in the previous year and also our targets for the following year. And I make sure that that's endorsed by the CEO and both chairs, so they're comfortable about what we've achieved and also comfortable about the goals we've set for the next year. It shows our carbon reduction output since our first report 11 years ago, and the effect that behaviour change and technological interventions have had on that over the intervening period. So that really helps us maintain the focus and their focus on what we've agreed to deliver. We also put them through, we introduce them to climate change as part of their induction process. Now, unfortunately, that has fallen by the wayside since COVID. We've got 2 new chairs, a third of the trustees have changed, and trying to resurrect that element of their induction process. But at the very least, they will be engaging in some carbon literacy training. My reasoning for that is, if they don't understand and accept the problem, they'll be less accepting of the solution. So in terms of those 3 questions, if you can answer those questions to your satisfaction, you should have no trouble convincing your board and any external funders. Next slide, please. So this is a guy trying to inflate a punctured tyre and not having a lot of success. And this reminds me of working with contractors on building work during a few capital projects we've run here. It's been interesting and challenging, probably in equal parts. You'll find with contractors, they're quite risk averse, so they like using technology they know and are wary if anything they're not sure of. Research in carbon reduction technology, as Andrew has shown, is moving very quickly, and sometimes you have more understanding of what's available and have done more research than they have. And part of what you have to do is educate and convince them. And also, on some occasions, I've known the solution that I want to reduce our carbon output and reduce our energy use, but the technology isn't there yet and hasn't kept up with our evolving demands. An example of this is our house lights in the main auditorium. We had 240-watt tungsten lamps that were burning huge amounts of electricity. They were on most of the day, and they failed regularly. You could guarantee that every pre-performance lamp check would show 2 or 3 had blown, which meant pulling chandeliers in and so on. And there was never a time when the auditorium was absolutely 100% perfect from a lighting perspective for more than sort of 48 hours. There was no LED equivalent available in the UK then that provided the correct temperature of light and the correct dimming up so we could get smoothly down to a blackout. Then the EU directed that tungsten lamps would no longer be manufactured, and suddenly stocks of replacement lamps began to run low and the price escalated. And you may have found that with your stage lamps as well. I put the problem out there to my local Chamber of Commerce and other groups. And I was contacted by a local businessman of Chinese heritage whose family owned an LED manufacturing facility in China. So he took a brief from me of what I was looking for and offered to get his family factory to design a prototype of a house light replacement and see if that worked for us. The response we got back from the factory a few weeks later was they already had a similar design available off the shelf. So we tested it, it worked. So I went back to them and said, look, the auditorium also has an emergency lighting system, 12-watt, 110-volt circuit and battery backup. And the Chinese factory were able to produce a sample 1-watt LED lamp that produced the same light intensity So we've replaced all the house lights for a few £100. We've replaced the emergency lamps for about 50 quid 18 months ago, and since then none have failed. So what I would say with contractors and with consultants is question everything. As Andrew said, you know more about your building and the way you operate than any consultant or contractor will. So they may be experts in your field, you're experts in your building. An example of that is a contractor who was arguing with me about some technology we wanted to introduce. And he said, look, the payback period is going to be 9 or 10 years on this. But my argument is, this is grant funded. I've got a grant to do this. The other stuff we can do ourselves because it's a fast payback time. So the cost benefit is, you know, indisputable. But with this long payback time, it has to be grant funded. So I don't care what the payback time is. It's not my money. It's not our money. So get it done. Now, with reference to the question of the flat tire being inflated, and this is something that Andrew touched on as well. I mean, we want to go down the route of air source heat pumps, but in our building, the way it is at the moment, it's just not viable. And another M&E consultant is still trying to convince me that air source heat pumps are the way forward for this Victorian building, leaks like a sieve, drafts everywhere, has no insulation, and pushing this relative trickle of warm air into an auditorium for it just to escape through the windows, doors and ceilings and walls and so on, it's just not viable. All the evidence points to the fact that this would never produce a decent return on the investment, and in fact would cost more to run than our gas boilers at the moment. So one thing I would suggest, and our boilers are between 25 and 30 years old at the moment, the two main boilers that heat the auditorium, it will probably be over the next 2 to 3 years, I'm going to have to replace them with another fossil fuel boiler because nobody's really come up with anything that convinces me that there's a better alternative out there. So don't be afraid of grasping the nettle. You are still on the path to reducing your carbon output because modern boilers are much more energy efficient than they were, and we'll make sure that we get a boiler in that can deal with a mix of natural gas and hydrogen in the future, if that's the way the supply goes. But there are sometimes you have to make difficult decisions on the way, and you can't get to air source heat pumps tomorrow. You might have to go on a stepping stone on that journey. Next slide, please. This is something that Andrew touched on. It helped me in my early days of this sustainability journey to know that I was not alone. And not only is there professional help and guidance available through local authorities, chambers of commerce, Julie's Bicycle, Green Book, and so on, there are obviously local arts organisations on a similar path, facing the same challenges. Some may be further along the curve than you are. So don't hesitate to share your and their knowledge and experience. Over the past few months, I've been involved in establishing a regional support group in this area called LANDS, which stands for Lancashire Arts Network for Developing Sustainability, where we aim to offer guidance to local artists and venues. And most of the areas of the country now have a similar type of organisation operating. Just before I go, I think we've got a couple of minutes to look at the way some of you have responded to the provocation we sent out in the invitation to the meeting. So what's your experience of trying to keep sustainability a central consideration in maintenance, development, or running of your theatre? And just let me share a couple of those now. One comment came back that the challenges of older buildings, shrinking budgets and opposition to change. Yes, older theatres present a challenge and a range of challenges to sustainability, and not all problems have viable solutions. Technology may improve when the time comes to make the decision, but I'm confident now that if we make decisions on gas boilers, for instance, that that's the right decision for us at the moment. Another point that came up was no one likes change. But if you use the evidence to demonstrate that reducing your carbon output usually means burning less electricity or gas, and that'll save you money, for trustees, it's a very persuasive argument for even the most ardent Luddite. Somebody else has mentioned having a listed building as a problem. We're grade 2 star, so we're fairly high up the food chain. I was grant funded to commission a conservation plan that was produced by Dr. David Wilmore, one of the foremost authorities on heritage theatres and Frank Matcham theatres in particular. He loves these theatres as much as anybody does, but he's also very pragmatic. And he was able to convincingly argue that our building has not been preserved in aspect for the last 130 years. It has evolved over time. There have been a number of interventions, including 2 interventions after he built the place by Frank Matcham himself. And he wasn't afraid to knock down walls, move staircases, improve airflow, and so on. And we've got to look at what changing tastes and audience demands require now. There's no point in trying to preserve something that no longer works when the technology exists to reduce carbon, burn less electricity, and be more energy efficient all around. And there are ways to do that and accommodate that within a listed building. Last slide, please. If you indulge me for just a second, this is a picture of Ruth Eastwood, who was my CEO for 9 years. Worked very closely with her on this building, and we had a great relationship. And she was also deputy chair of Theatres Trust for many years, and had just started a new position as theatres advisor on Theatres Trust in February. And unfortunately, in the last few weeks, she has died. So I would like to dedicate this presentation to the memory of Ruth. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you also for that beautiful dedication to our much loved and dearly missed friend and colleague, Ruth Eastwood. And finally, to introduce us to our third speaker, Angela Watchner, who is General Manager at the Bush Theatre in London. Driving a more environmentally sustainable theatre industry has been a key focus for Angela over the last decade. She's a member of the Theatre Green Book Buildings Committee and has greatly contributed to version 2 of the publication that was launched at the beginning of June. She's currently undertaking a capital project to progress decarbonisation at the Bush Theatre. Today, Angela is going to talk to us about building a sustainability culture for your organisation and why this is so important in the future resilience of a theatre. So, Angela, over to you.
Thanks so much, Claire. Good afternoon, everyone. I can't see anyone, but I know you're all out there. I just want to say it's really exciting to be here talking about our sustainability journey and how we've engaged with our staff, audiences and local community to support us to create an organisational change and resilience for the future, as Claire said. So for those of you who don't know about us, the Bush Theatre is based in Shepherd's Bush since 1972. We champion new playwrights and produce some of the best work our country has to offer, reflecting the diversity and vibrancy of British culture. We started out in a small room above a pub, though, on the corner of Shepherd's Bush Green. And in 2011, we moved around the corner to the old Passmore Edwards Library on Uxbridge Road. We underwent further redevelopment to create more space and then reopened again in 2017. We now have 2 performance spaces with a combined capacity of around 300. Our programme runs year round and we produce or present around 10 full-length plays a year, as well as a series of events for our Alt-B programme of spoken word, music, cabaret and comedy, and a series of community participation programmes that run throughout the year and engage our local community in West London. The redevelopment project was a brilliant opportunity for us to make some major changes to our environmental sustainability. We've added a living sedum roof, insulation, air handling system that is more sustainable, secondary glazing, solar panels, and LED lighting and sensors throughout the building. So we did a lot of work in 2016 to make the building more sustainable. In terms of our journey in 2012, the Bush was lucky to be part of a combined programme that was run by the London Theatre Consortium and Julie's Bicycle, exploring sustainability with a focus on carbon reduction as a fitting response to climate change. And this programme was really instrumental in setting us on our journey, understanding our impact, and creating a roadmap for us to follow. Previous to that, I know certainly in most of the theatres that I worked in, there wasn't very much focus on sustainability, if any. We realised early in our journey that to make significant change, we needed to rally and inspire the people that make everything happen day to day, and who feel a sense of ownership for the building and the work that we do. So our staff, our artists, our audience, and our local community. We started simple, and we made environmental sustainability part of everyone's job description. We added a clause to our employment contracts that made it everyone's responsibility to actively enact the Bush Theatre's environmental sustainability policy and action plan, which we had developed with the support of Julie's Bicycle back in 2012. Then we started talking to people. So our audiences, our staff. We asked if they were worried about climate change, what they wanted us to do about it, how we could help them to make change for themselves. So for the last 5 years, we've conducted an annual survey to gather opinions and track progress. So a quick snapshot of this year's findings. 70% of staff feel that the Bush have a strong commitment to environmental sustainability. And environmental sustainability policies seem to be increasingly important to our ability to recruit talent, as 45% of staff say that our approach to environmental sustainability is important to their decision to work with us, and that 56% said they would choose not to work with an organisation whose environmental policies they did not agree with. So that's increasingly important for us. 85% of staff say that our approach to environmental sustainability is important to how good they feel at work. And some of what our staff have asked for, that sustainability of productions be considered from initial conversations with creatives, that we partner with Shepherd's Bush Market, which is right next door to us, for snacks and foods instead of relying on established global brands. That we build relationships with artists who are interested in using art to communicate this issue and encourage action, and simple things like additional storage for sets and props to avoid wastage. From our audiences, 86% have said they are concerned about environmental sustainability, which is quite high. 38% of our audience said organisations' sustainability approach would impact their choice to attend. An awareness of the Bush Theatre's environmental sustainability approach has steadily been increasing over the 3 surveys that we've conducted with our audience since 2020. And we're now at 35% of audiences having a good understanding of what we're already doing. Nearly half of our audience, 49%, think we're doing a good or very good job with our environmental sustainability efforts, but we're conscious that that means that half think we could do a lot better. So we listen to that as well. And some of what our audience thinks we should be doing. Recycling staging, we do, but clearly we're not telling people about it. Share our story more, potentially a digital membership card. Someone suggested a big ask, but retrofit the building to make it more energy efficient. We're working on this, and that's part of our second sustainability project. Ensure human rights are factored into our environmental sustainability work, and align some of our productions with environmental themes to stimulate audience awareness. But we're conscious also that some of our audience don't think we should be thinking about sustainability. And while we don't agree, we still listen to their thoughts and what we can do to ensure that their fears are allayed. So we had a respondent say, your main mission is surely to serve the community by creating excellent theatre. Dilute this focus too much and you will lose your way. Very happy to know you believe in the value of recycling, etc. But if you become preachy, you risk making bad art. So we hear that, and we make sure we consider that within the work that we do. So understanding the impacts of our efforts outside of carbon calculations has led to fundamental changes in our approach, and we've redeveloped our environmental sustainability policy and action plan in collaboration with our very passionate staff team. They pushed us to go beyond recycling and energy conservation to integrate our commitment into our artistic work and recognise the impact on our communities, many of who are from the Global South, whose ancestral lands will be at the coalface of environmental devastation, as we know. As a relatively young workforce, we found our staff team have a deep and personal understanding of the urgency of making change for their future. So actually engaging them in the work from that point of view has been relatively easy. To really foster engagement, we started an internal green working group with people from across the organisation. This group reports back on progress with the action plan. They come up with ideas for audience engagement, and they share any wins that they've had in their individual departments. Last year, we added an additional arm to the Green Group, looking specifically at the Theatre Green Book and how we could achieve a baseline show in the coming season. So the Green Group has now been running an annual Green Week for 6 years to get our community involved with sustainability as a topic and the work that we're doing at the Bush. As part of the program, the group has held workshops and talks. A waste management company, First Mile, talked about recycling. We had Extinction Rebellion in to talk about the climate crisis and direct action. And one of our staff team ran a workshop on gardening with everyday items to reduce plastic waste. Our young company alums, Coral Wiley and Mariam Garad, have both been commissioned to share work during one of our Green Weeks. Coral, a theatre maker and wildlife educator from West London, is fascinated by bugs and the natural world, and they contributed a poem about plant life, as well as creating an amazing bug hotel that sits on our roof, which you can see on the slide there. Mariam, a performer and writer and a recipient of our Bloom Writers Bursary, wrote an article giving us a rundown on how to consume more consciously, and that's some of the work that we do as part of the Green Week, which comes out of the Green Working Group. And my favourite Green Week project so far, which saw a cross-departmental group construct a photographic exhibition and installation called Bush Cycling, following the life of a piece of wood through our production cycle, and what has happened to some of our set pieces. You can see some of our set around the building now and in use by our visitors. I think if you go to the next slide, there'll be a picture of, our Bush Cycled exhibition. So it took over a whole wall in our building, showing the journey of a piece of wood through these different productions. We have found that a key turning point for us in engaging our team more deeply with this work has really been carbon literacy training, and particularly the work that the Unicorn's technical director was doing in terms of delivering carbon literacy training. Around a third of our team have now completed the training, including key people in our producing and technical teams. And this has particularly shifted our focus on productions, which has been a really difficult area for us to impact. The production team now has developed a production tracker to help them manage the consumption of different materials and to track where these items end up, as well as tracking energy consumption of each show, which of course we use on our Julie's Bicycle reporting as well, on the Creative Green tools, but is useful for them to track as they go. They're now looking at establishing a seasonal budget to balance across all the shows throughout the season. And then last year, the Arts Council supported Julie's Bicycle program was launched to support board members to engage more actively with the issue of sustainability in our theatre buildings and companies. And I'm really proud to say that we have a sustainability champion now on our board. And though, of course, the trustees have been very supportive of all the work we've done over the last 12 years, we feel this is a real turning point in creating deep organisational change. We initially had struggled to engage our voluntary board to take on this additional responsibility, as so many of them are already doing meaningful work for us, supporting us in financial understanding, legal issues, and with fundraising efforts. And we also felt that they might have lacked the confidence in their knowledge of how to create impact in this area. So moving forward, we're really hopeful that our board champion, who is a playwright and a director, will support us to really consider how our work needs to evolve to accommodate the changes necessary to reach net zero while maintaining excellence in production. We have encountered a few pitfalls along the way, so it hasn't all been smooth sailing, with the biggest one being time, which I'm sure is the case for a lot of people. Even the easy wins are difficult if you don't have the time to actually implement them. But not just having enough time, but also being able to plan interventions early enough in a process to have a meaningful impact. Secondly, the perception of people, as you heard earlier with the audience comment, that it will impede creativity and artistic excellence, which we don't think it should. We have restrictions on budgets and space and all sorts of things that we work with quite easily. This is just something else that we need to consider in our process. And finally, knowledge about how to make change has been a factor which we, with the carbon literacy training, feel that we're really moving forward on resolving now. So as Claire said, we're now undertaking a second capital project to move us even closer to net zero. And as part of this work, we again engaged our staff on how this work will serve what they need, what change they need to make, and we'll continue this conversation with them as we go. And we are looking at installing an air source heat pump as part of that project. In the future, we want to actively involve our local community more, like Restart Gardening Group that was never really able to take off due to the COVID pandemic, which we'd started back in 2019, set up space for local clothes swaps, create a cheap and accessible refill station for our locals, things like that, and to really braid it into our community programming that's already in place. We also want to begin to articulate our position that environmental sustainability is social justice more strongly. How do we advocate for and create space for the people and communities that will be most impacted by climate change? And in this way, we're exploring partnerships, commissions, artistic advocates to see how we can move this forward. We still have a lot to learn, but we think if we keep talking to people who care about us and what we do, that we're going to keep moving in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Angela. It's really fascinating to hear about how you went about building that culture change with the engagement with the local community, and with all of your audiences and your staff as well, and just how you're starting on that journey towards future sustainability. It's fantastic. I'd like to thank all of our speakers for their presentations today, for sharing those key learnings and passing on all of that practical and pragmatic advice and guidance on how to approach sustainability within our theatres. There was an awful lot of crossover of messaging from all three. I'm sure everybody has learnt an awful lot. And I think we can all agree on just how important it is for theatre to achieve climate and ecological sustainability. It can often feel daunting about how and where to start. So I really hope this webinar has provided everyone both a valuable insight, but also some positivity to move forward on their own journey. Okay, we can stop the recording.